Hi, my Strangelings. Welcome to Getting Strange with Steffany Strange. And today, on this Mystic Monday, we'll be diving into premonitions. You might know about premonitions from your own experiences or through pulp culture. There's some movies that we'll be talking about premonitions. We'll also explore this topic in further depth, and we have a very special guest and who will be helping me dissect this topic.
Viewer discretion is strongly advised. In this episode, we talk a lot about death and even touch base on a story regarding sexual assault.
Okay, cool. So our special guest today is Noah from Real Hauntings. Noah, could you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, how you started your podcast, and your thoughts on paranormal experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, thank you for having me on your podcast. Super excited to be here. So I started Real Hauntings podcast with two friends. I guess about 4 years ago at this point. Now it's kind of just me running the show, and I have some guest host on from time to time, or guest co-host rather. But yeah, so I got interested in the paranormal. I had an experience when I was a teen in a haunted mansion that my friend lived in. It was a pretty like the house looked cool. It took up like a whole block, and I didn't grow up in like a ritzy area. It was like a town of 15,000 people. This was like the house that looked like that in the town. But and it had
Okay.
an yeah, it was crazy, and it had an elevator in it that would just randomly turn on and off in the middle of the night and go up and down. And he had an older sister that was like very big into the occult. So I don't know if that played into some of the spookiness that took place, but short story long, or long story short, basically we were playing hide and seek one night in his room. He had a sister that was like a year younger than him, and she had a friend that was playing hide and go seek too. We played a version where we turned off all the lights, and the people that were hiding could not move once they were hidden, and I was it, so I was looking for them. I saw one of them take off across the room, and I was going to be a jerk and like swing my hand into them because, like, hey, they're cheating. I'm gonna show them, and my hand went right through them. We like
What?
every Yeah, my hand went right through them, and the entity, like, this is the part that is forever seared into my memory. It just like turned like this, like it's like, get my hand to my camera like this, and it was like kind of red reflective eyes, kind of like a Jawa. And it was super scary, and we all screamed. Everybody in the room saw what happened. We went to his playroom, which is about the size of a normal house, and nobody said anything. The lights flickered a couple times on and off, and we just kind of sat there, and we never really talked about it again until that same friend, he used to come visit me in Atlanta, and we go to a concert or whatever. And one time I was like, hey, you remember we were kids and that weird thing? And before I could finish the sentence, he was like, oh, when we saw that ghost played in hide and go seek, he was like, I was literally talking about that a couple weeks ago.
Oh
So
my God.
I guess it really happened. I struggle with the fact that I've told the story so many times, whether the memory is the story or the story is the memory. But yeah, that's how I remember it. And so that was kind of the antithesis for me starting Real Hauntings, Real Ghost Stories. I had this experience, and I was still skeptical, even though I'd had like a pretty strong experience and had a couple other little things happen throughout my life. And my co-hosts were also skeptical. And so we went on this journey of getting people's firsthand paranormal experiences, like you when you came on, and you've since been on the podcast like 100 times now, has helped me as a co-host. And
Oh.
yeah, and so throughout time, I've heard all these stories, and I went from being a skeptic to just a full-on believer. I had another, really my only other seeing an apparition story, or experience rather, 2 years ago in Vegas. My wife and I went to When We Were Young Fest, and on Halloween, oddly enough, and we stayed in, I think it was Mandalay Bay. And so around like 3 in the morning, I woke up, and I looked over, or honestly, I may have already been rolled over because I sleep on my side, and I saw a child staring at me. And it wasn't in like full color, and it was in a very dated garb. I would say like 1920s, late 1800s. And I was like, in my head, I was like, okay. I mean, it wouldn't be anybody else's head, but I was like, well, I'm obviously having sleep paralysis. I've had that before. Typically, I just see a spider drop down. I'm going to roll over and roll back over, and I'll be over. So that's what I did. I rolled over, rolled back over, and he was still there, just staring at me. Didn't feel threatening. I felt kind of like a fish in a fishbowl. And then I remember my heart starting to beat a little faster. And I was just kind of, and you would think after interviewing like 400 people, I'd have been like, yes, it's happening. This will be great fodder for the podcast. No, I was starting to panic. And I was like, okay, I'm going to roll over again. I'm seeing things, whatever. Roll back over. Not only is he there, but now an adult male apparition is behind him with his hand on his shoulder. I assume it was his father. He seemed like a father figure. Those were the vibes I got. And at this point, I just pulled the sheet over my head, which I've heard people do in so many stories, and often wondered, how could you do that in such a fight or flight situation? I did the exact same thing, fell asleep, woke up the next morning. My wife is very skeptical of the paranormal. She was headed towards the bathroom. I was getting up and I was like, babe, you never believe what happened. I saw this kid ghost and I think his father right next to the bed. And she was like, okay, ghost boy, save it for the podcast, and just went on into the bathroom to get ready.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so, yeah, those are my two major paranormal experiences. The podcast has been great. It's my true love is interviewing interesting people. And it's hard to find a boring person when they're trying to convince you that they saw a ghost. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit on me. My home base is in Atlanta. I just recently this year started doing paranormal cons. I'm going to be going to one in Madison, Wisconsin in early August. So I'm excited about that. But yeah, so that's me in a nutshell.
Oh, that sounds exciting. Well, okay, so let me go back a little bit. So when you were experienced that sleepover at that mansion, how old were you?
I would say no older than 12. I think 11, but at the oldest 12.
Okay, cool. And I kind of, what's interesting about that story, because I've told you, I think I've told you the story too, where me and my friend, we saw like a shadow thing chase after us. And if it wasn't for her experiencing that with me, I would have just gaslit myself into feeling like I made it up.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that your friends, yeah, it was your friend, or did you have another
Mhm.
person there with you? But
Yeah, so it was my friend, his sister, and her friend were the ones playing hide and go seek, and everybody screamed. So I assume everybody saw it.
yeah. So I just find that so interesting too, because like I wonder, right? Like if I know you said a question out loud, like, did I have I now rewritten that story or did it really happen? I actually think that you did experience that. And if your friend said that, like then I feel like there's definitely some validness to that. Anyway, the other reason that I asked too is because how old were you when you had the other experience in Vegas?
Yeah, so that would have been like 2 years ago. So like 37, 38, somewhere in that ballpark.
And I think that's an interesting thing to point out to people because I feel like even if like people who believe in the paranormal, it doesn't always mean that we're going to see like a physical apparition. It's so rare. It happens so far in between.
Mhm.
And I think that's like your testament to that, right? Like you've been hearing people's stories, you've been so open to it, but realistically, you've only had like two experiences where you actually saw a physical apparition. I don't know,
Yeah.
just something that I want to point out to people because I get it so much where they're like, oh, well, you must believe everything's a ghost. It's like, not necessarily. Like, I
Yeah.
would love to see, I would love to see more ghosts. Like, I really would, but it's so rare in physical form, at least.
Right.
So the other thing too, speaking of like Vegas and stuff like that, and like your experiences, I feel like people can pick up on it, but you're also a comedian. You have that humor side to you. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my early 30s, I got into doing improv. I'd always wanted to do stand up, and I did stand up for a little bit, but found that managing working just like a regular job and doing stand up was a little more than I could do. And improv was a little more of like kind of a team sport, and you could kind of have a friend community around it where stand up is not that. But yeah, I fell in love with it. I did stand up for 7-ish years. Was on main cast at one of the theaters in Atlanta and loved it. And that's actually where I met my two co-hosts for Real Hauntings. We were all improvisers at Village Theater is the name of the theater.
I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I've noticed that there's a lot of comedians that are into the paranormal or have had like, so I'll give you an example. There's a podcast I listen to that it's like three comedians. I also have a friend that I met while I was doing a reading for her, and she's a comedian. You're a comedian. Like, I'm like, what is
I
it?
have a couple different theories on this.
Okay.
One, I think people that experience, I mean, this is dark, but I think people that experience some kind of a trauma when they're young are more open to the paranormal for whatever reason. Um, People that have to kind of become an adult faster than we're meant to. And I think a lot of comedians fall into that category. They exist, but there are very few comedians that I have met that are like, my childhood was the best. Let me tell you about it. Usually it's the opposite. Oh God, after shows sometimes, like my really good friends, when I was doing improv, we would go to this bar and play this game called Broken Childhood to see who could make everybody else tap out first. And we played it one time and we were like,
Stop.
yeah, we were like, why are we
Stop.
playing this? What's the worst idea ever? But
That
so that's kind of the mindset. So I think when you've already been through things that a lot of people haven't, and you also experience the paranormal, you're kind of more willing to accept that that was also part of your life. But yeah, I've noticed that too. I think a lot of creatives in general, which I put comedians in that category, are more open to the paranormal. Some of it may be because, there are people that believe in like getting downloads. Like, I don't know where this idea came from. Like where did the idea for the song come from? Where did those lyrics
Mhm.
come from? Where did the idea for this joke? Like, it just came to me. Or, if you want to look at it from like a psychic medium standpoint, like I was just standing there and something told me, hey, this person had X thing happen, and then I verified it with them, or whatever the case. So I think all that runs together, and I think because of that, people in comedy are willing to go there. I think also the paranormal is a nice juxtaposition for comedy because it can get pretty dark and serious, much like a lot of jokes can, and then the flip or the switch can be really funny in that
Yeah.
scenarios. So I think it also lends itself to that, but who knows?
No,
That's my
I
guess.
agree with you. I just had Sapphire on for one of the podcast episodes, and we talked about like being I feel like the creative process, right? I think for any creative, uh I feel like what's most important is the journey, not so much like a very linear step-by-step process on the outcome. And I think that alone is so important to being intuitive, to being open to experience things, because we allow ourselves to trust the process rather than like the outcome, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And I think when it comes to comedians, what I really admire is that it's finding the duality of like the dark and making it into the light again and finding a twist to that. I think that takes a very special skill set, and it really does come in handy for people that if they're going to be around this, you have to learn to shift your mindset to a positive, because it can get real dark and it can
Yeah.
consume you. So I love that you said that. Speaking of like feeling intuitive or feeling like open to this stuff, have you ever had any experiences with premonitions or anything like that?
Yes, not only have I had them, they kind of run in my family, which is super weird because my family is not full of like woo-woo people who would generally just accept like, hey, people get premonitions, here's mine. But my mom and dad both get them. And for my mom, I witnessed it. She didn't just come out and tell me. And it wasn't until I later asked her about this, she told me. And my dad just told me one day, once, we talked about the podcast and stuff as it kind of got bigger. He was like, well, let me tell you about what happens to me. But for me, I've experienced it a couple different ways. So early on, the most common way for me was in dreams. I'm a very vivid dreamer. And so when I was younger, I would have dreams and then they would come true. Didn't happen a ton. I'd say a handful of times that I can remember. The most vibrant one isn't exciting, but basically it was I had a really good friend as a kid who lived down the street, and she had an older brother who was kind of a dick. Um, and I had this dream that we were at the pool, like the local pool, playing, and he showed up with his older guy friends, and we had a like a, one of those inflatable volleyballs, and like an 80s movie, we were just like throwing it back and forth like, yay. And then he walked up and went wham and just like smashed it. And him and his friends laughed at us. That happened. Like it literally played out the next day, like beat by beat. And then other times I had dreams like that happen, but I wouldn't necessarily remember them crystal clear. And I would get a very like euphoric deja vu in the middle of something happening. Like, for example, this happened one time I was at work. I was having a conversation where I had to kind of like give a speech, and other people were talking in that same manner. And all of a sudden it felt like I was in this experience in third person, and I was just like, oh, this person's going to say this, and then they did that, and this person's going to say this, and then they did that, and it was like, I'm going to say this, and then I did this. Obviously, like, I'm in control of what I say, but it's kind of hard to explain. And then it's kind of snapped out of it. Again, it wasn't like a life defining moment. It was just like a thing that happened that was super weird. And I used to get deja vu a decent amount, and that would always kind of freak me out. Now, I will say I've been on Lexapro for like 4+ years now, and it's basically killed off any of that. Like I've always had this idea that for me, the paranormal, the premonitions, all that stuff is derived from stress for me, a lot of it. And or as I would tell my 4-year-old, big emotions. And so I think Lexapro really tapered that down to a good extent. But now, as far as like talking about that download sensation as a premonition, I mean, you can tell me if you consider this a premonition or not. But and I think I may have told you this story at one point. I was in college and I was going to go buy a computer from a guy on Craigslist. And I love to barter with people. And one of the key things, especially like now that Facebook Marketplace exists, when you like try to get somebody to come down on their price, they almost always kick back at you, and they're never like just like, yep, sure, come get it. Well, this guy did. And it was like a really good deal. So here I am in my early, like 20s or whatever, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to get this gaming computer. And I went and I got to the point of like going to get in my car, and as I was going to get in my car, I started just getting this very just like yuck feeling. And then I sat in the car and I was like, something just does not feel right. And something told me to Google this guy's cell phone number, which is like such a random thing to do, especially like, 15, 18 years ago. God, I'm getting old. And so I Googled it, and it literally, and this is weird too. It came up with his phone number that he was a registered sex offender felon on home arrest.
Stop.
And yeah, and so obviously I didn't go get the computer. And who's to say that something bad would have happened to me? I don't know. But I think it was more likely than not, or more probable, that something probably would have happened, because it certainly feels like a trap looking back on it. So I don't know if that's necessarily considered a premonition, because I didn't like walk through the experience, but
Yeah.
something happened out of the ordinary that made me do that.
I want to get into also like the differences between premonitions, psychic readings, and downloads and deja vu, but I definitely feel like there's something there with that. Absolutely. And I know I just want to make sure that people follow like the definition of that. So before I even dive into what you just said, I want to talk a little bit about that. So premonitions, to me at least, or how I perceived it, is like it is basically receiving a download, right? I think if I get technical with it, I would, at least for me, I would categorize it as like seeing the vision of future events, which is exactly what you experienced. Like you were feeling like, if I go, something bad might happen. Where I feel like psychic downloads or psychic readings in particular, those are like when, you're talking to somebody and you're reading the past, present, and future to seek guidance to a possible outcome, or like what could happen, or seek guidance in terms of maybe if you're doing ritual things, or if you want to know about your job or something like that, right? I feel like downloads are just knowing things without understanding why you know that, which falls into the umbrella of psychicness, like claircognizance. And then I feel like deja vu is interesting because that, I think, to me, sometimes there's two categories. There's experiencing deja vu where it could be from an experience that maybe you dreamt of it, but you don't remember the dream. So when it finally happens, you're like, this is deja vu, but I
Mm.
just don't remember. And then I also feel like there's the other sector of deja vu where, I'm gonna get all Delulu and conspiracy, but I feel like this is also maybe from having like experience similar in a different reality, alternate reality. And now
Mm.
you're seeing this with a different outcome. That's my Delulu talking, but I feel like that could be a possibility. Again, take what I say with a grain of salt, but I can very much feel that at times. What are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, I mean that's another reason I love the podcast, because I'm not one to think that I have the answers or whatnot, but we can't help but have our own opinions, right, with the supernatural.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to hear so many different people's takes and just how much like similarity there is sometimes through the ether of the paranormal. I don't know. I mean, with gosh, and you know me, I'm not one to really like get
Yeah.
woo woo and stuff. So, but I mean, I'll just be honest with you. I feel like it's whatever the universe is, however you want to quantify that. Like when that experience happened, and I didn't go get that computer. I feel like that was whatever we consider the universe. I felt like that was that speaking to me.
Yeah.
And when you get into like having where I've had dreams and they come true, that stuff is baffling to me because
Mhm.
I already have a low self-esteem. So for me to be like, well, I'm a X-Men, I'm a psychic, I could, it feels
Stop.
so wild to say stuff like that for me personally. But I don't know. I don't know if that's just like cracks in the energy of the world and we're able to absorb that stuff sometimes, or if there is like splits, like parallel universes, or if we just are capable of more than we realize. It's also just interesting that some people remember their dreams and some don't. Some people will
Yeah.
say like, I don't dream. And that's really not at least science would tell us that's not the case. They just don't remember them.
Mhm.
So, so yeah,
Or they
that's
might be too
kind of,
traumatic to remember too I think that's also another thing, like, they might be too
yeah.
traumatic.
I hate the fact that I remember all my dreams or,
Really?
remember them like when I wake up. Yeah, because a lot of them are bad. And then, and this is good. I'm such a Debbie Downer. Some of them are so good that when I wake up, and I, look, I have a good life. I can't complain, but like some of them are so emotionally good. And I wake up and I realize like, oh, that version of me in that dream is not like, that's not my life. That
Yeah.
person I was just with in that dream is not a real person, et cetera. Because my dreams are like very vivid, very intense. I told the story before when I was young, like 18, 19. I had a dream where I literally like met somebody on a beach, got married, like had kids in the dream, and it ended with like me sitting on the couch with like my wife and two kids running around. And then I woke up and I just started crying because it was so intense for it not to be real.
Yeah.
um and so I like, what's that? I don't know, like it's a lot of questions, Steffany, not a lot of answers.
Well, I'll at least I can help for some aspects. So not many people know this, but it is on my services on my link tree. I do dream interpretations. I've done a few already, 101s this year, which I had taken a break from readings 101 and all this stuff. So I've been so happy to start doing it again and alongside my workshops and stuff like that, in person. And I recently had a client who desperately wanted a dream like interpretation. And so, we did it together and she's like, I'm embarrassed because I keep having a dream of my first love. And like, I don't want to be with him. I don't miss him. It's so weird because when I'm awake, I never think of this person. And it makes me sad sometimes, like with the feelings and stuff like that. And it's interesting because, I said to her, okay, cool. Well, let's reassess this. One thing I've learned about dreams in terms of dream interpretation with people is that a lot of times our dreams are literally playing a movie about our lives, but detaching ourselves from it. So when we see the dreams playing out, it's either like our subconscious trying to tell us something that we haven't processed yet, or trying to tell us something that we keep running from. And it will sometimes amplify it and make it so exaggerative. But in a nutshell, with this client that I was helping, I told her, I said, well, what's happening here is that you're not in love with life anymore. And you are seeing this first love as the feeling of experiencing love for the very first time and how it made you feel about life. And you're just you're not happy right now. You're not in love with life, and you need to start falling in love with life again. And she started crying, and she's like, you're right. I don't go outside anymore. I haven't done any walks. I've been in my apartment working nonstop. I'm in such big depression, and it's hard for me to connect with people again. I'm like, yeah. So this first love isn't you missing this person. They are a symbol of what you felt. So sometimes dreams come in very unexpected ways. And anyway, I'm glad I was able to help her out with that. But on the other side, sometimes dreams can also tell us things that are much more, which we're about to get into. Actually, I'm excited to share some of these other examples, much more than just different facets of ourselves. And so, with that being said, I wanted to talk about how dreams have helped people, come up with things and premonitions, things that happen in the future. So, before I start this topic, though, do you know of any people that stick out to you that, like, historical figures, famous figures, have had a premonition that freaked you out or anything like that?
Famous no, I mean, the only it's funny that my mom is not famous, but her premonition is the one that sticks out to me the most of any that I've ever heard, which is
Mm-hmm.
weird, but maybe that's because I experienced it. I can share that if you want me to. I don't
Yeah,
know if
absolutely.
okay.
Yes.
So it was Christmas morning, probably 20-ish years ago. And Christmas morning, I'm, walking around the tree, whatever normal Christmas shit you do. And my mom comes into the room. I distinctly remember she had on like her robe. She's walking in and she's just crying. And, that's usually not the vibe for Christmas morning. And so we're all like, what's up? Like, are you okay? And she starts telling us that she had a dream where her cousin, who is really more like her brother, she grew up and they were best friends in this really small town. She's like, I had this dream that he was in a car wreck with his wife and his kids, and his wife died, and he and all the kids were there and had to witness it in this awful car wreck.
Oh
She was
my
like, it was
gosh.
so real, and she was upset. And I get chills even just remembering this. But anyway, the phone rang. She gets a call. It's her cousin, and he tells her that last night he was in a really bad wreck. His wife died. Him and the kids are okay. And what had happened, a drunk driver hit him, but the vehicle they were in, her door came off. And when it did, somehow I think it like took the seatbelt off with it or something. The seatbelt had a malfunction. So she shouldn't have even had died.
That's so sad.
But yeah, so I shared that story on my podcast, like early days, and didn't think much about it. Went on with my life, and then I saw one of my mom's cousin's sons, who's a little closer to my age, and he was visiting, and he was like, "Hey, I checked out your podcast," and I was like, "Oh, cool." And then it hit me that I'd shared that story and like didn't ask for permission from anybody before I shared it. And he was like, "Did that really happen?" And I was like, "I yes." I was like, as far as I remember, then you start questioning yourself, like, shit, did I embellish that or
Oh,
what?
wow.
And but I told him, I was like, yeah, it happened. And then I immediately called my mom and I was like, hey, am I remembering this right or remembering wrong? She was like, no, that's exactly how it happened. She was like, I think about it all the time. And yeah, so that's the one that whenever I think of premonitions that I just immediately go to, because it was wild to see it
Yeah.
play out.
Oh God, chills. Yeah, that makes me think of the one that I've told a few times on my socials, but I'll share it here briefly. My sister, I feel like my family has dreamer. I call them dreamers. I'm not, I need to stop saying that because I feel like I do, but it not to the extent that they do. I feel like for me, I have premonitions, which I think this is a good time to call this out. I feel like there's premonitions where, like in your case, your mom's case, the dream happened as such and very much almost to the T, right? And then there's like premonitions where you see symbology and then you're like, that's what that symbology was. And now it's happening. So I'll share my sister's story. So when she was in high school, a friend of hers, she had a dream that I think it was like, I always mess this up. I need to ask her and write it down so I know so I can stop flip-flopping this. But the point of the matter is that she had a dream that her friends, her high school friends, I think father or grandfather it was a grandfather, got into a car accident. And she told a friend this. The friend's like, you're crazy. And then a week later, the grandfather got in a car accident and passed away.
Hmm.
I'm like, what the heck? And then I've had dreams where like I write it down because it makes no sense. And then 6 months later, I revisit the dream and I'm like, oh my God, this whole symbology was this person going on a trip. And it was trying to warn me to prepare myself for this trip because it was really hard on me that this person left. And but I didn't see it at the time because it wasn't spelled out as such. It was more like different symbology that I just didn't understand. And in the dream, I saw it through the perspective of the person that left on this trip rather than me. And that's why I didn't get it until it happened. I'm like, oh my God, I was seeing it through their perspective.
Right.
And I just didn't understand. So I think sometimes premonitions can be even more abstract than what people think it is. And so speaking of like death, I know I'm going to do a warning on this, but it is a warning. We talk a lot about death on this on this particular episode. Premonition. I feel like this has been tied to a lot of death. But there have been famous figures that have had premonitions. So let's start with Abraham Lincoln. So there's allegedly talk that Abraham Lincoln might have had his premonition of his own assassination. So he's if people don't know this, Abraham Lincoln is the 16th president of the United States, and he reportedly had a dream about walking through the White House and finding a corpse guarded by soldiers. And when he asked who had died, they told him it was the president. This premonition foreshadowed his assassination by John Wilkes Booth in 1865. It's interesting because when I think about this, I feel like a lot of people, famous people, have you ever heard this where they're like, I feel like I'm going to die young, right? I don't know if you have heard that, but I feel like I have
Yeah.
heard that. What do you think of this? Are there any thoughts? Do you feel it being true or do you think it's maybe sensationalized?
Like the idea of famous people having premonitions and specifically like dying young. Is that the question or?
Yes, thank you for
Okay.
that clarification. Yeah.
No, it's okay. For some reason, I feel like that was really in vogue too, like the early 2000s, but maybe I'm just thinking of all the celebrities that died young.
Like the 27 Club.
Yeah. Yeah. And which is also weird. My family has a curse with the men dying on my mom's side before 60. And
Stop.
that same cousin I just told you about, he died before 60.
Stop it.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're not speaking life into this.
Yeah. Fun times. But no, yeah, I mean, I think it's like, I think it's strange in general that celebrity exists. I used to be super fascinated about people that had broken through the zeitgeist. And every now and then I would get somebody on the podcast who had really broken through, whether it was, oh shit, now I can't even think of his name, but the radio DJ on Kiss FM in LA. Anyway, doesn't matter. But no, I would get to interview like, people that had some form of fame and they had broken through the zeitgeist, and it really fascinated me to be able to talk to them and be like, what was it like going from you being like quote unquote a normal person to, now millions of people knowing who you are and wanting to know what you do, and et cetera, et
Mhm.
cetera. So I think when you become famous like that, especially if you're like super famous, like a singer, an actor, somebody that we all really like sweat and follow, you're probably taking on a ton of energy. Celebrities taking on energy all the time. And used to, it would just be like they could just go to their home and close everything off. But now with the advent of social media, if they choose to, they can be surrounded by it literally 24/7. They can constantly read what people think and have all this weight put on them. So the fact that they could tap into the world of premonitions and also see themselves like, perishing young. I think part of that also could be a lot of times people reach that level of fame and they don't think they deserve it. So I think there's some
Yeah.
self-doubt, like imposter syndrome, like, oh, I guess I'm going to die young because life is so great. So I don't know if that answers
Yeah.
your question, but I definitely think that it could be a possibility.
Well, yeah, and I'm gonna get to another point too, because I'm gonna hold that thought because then there's also John Lennon. So John Lennon also had his own premonition as well. So it was reportedly that legendary musician John Lennon, he was part of the Beatles. He had reoccurring dreams of his death. In one of his interviews, he mentioned having a feeling that he would be killed. So John Lennon was tragically assassinated outside of his New York City apartment in December of 1980. And it's interesting because he not only was he said in an interview, he had also been saying it to his friends. So to your point, I feel like, yeah, I feel like celebrities and musicians, actors, they reach a high level of fame where either they might, I'm going to bring in the logical side of it. I think that they get paranoia, right? That like no one's really on their side or they're hyper fixated or stalking. And then there's also like people that just tragically die out of nowhere at a very young age. Um, but I think that's weird that he kept saying that he felt like he was going to be killed. And I feel like on one side, it's like, well, yeah, if people have eyes on you, you're going to feel that people hate you, right?
Yeah.
But on the other end, it's so weird that he was telling people, like, no, I feel like I'm going to get killed, like friends and interviews and things of that nature. And
Well,
the
and
fact that,
sometimes you just know things. Like you can't
mm,
explain how you know it. And I don't know if you do this, but when I get those intrusive thoughts like this is going to happen, I immediately tell myself, no, it's not. Like I'm trying to like it got
yes,
put in the world and I'm trying to pull it back. I'm like,
yes,
nope, it's not going to happen.
I do the singer. I'm like, cancel, cancel, cancel.
Yes.
Like, no,
It's so
canceling, canceling. Um,
funny.
okay, we'll do a positive one, a premonition. So Albert Einstein had a premonition, I'm going to say allegedly premonition because I know some people will get pissed about this, but whatever. Theory of relativity. So Einstein reportedly had a vivid dream in which he was sledding down a steep mountainside, going faster and faster until he approached the speed of light. This dream contributed to this contemplation of the nature of light and motion, leading to the development of his special theory of relativity. Relativity, Jesus. Um, so that one is interesting because I think it's do I call it a premonition? I don't know. I think it's more so like maybe he was just so overworking on these theories that his dreams helped him conceptualize that. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you look at Stephen King, who has said that so many of his books are based on the nightmares that he has. He figured out a way to turn his dreams into his creative process. Now, that's not exactly a one-to-one to what you just talked about with Einstein, but I definitely think that our dreams can hand us gifts, like
Mhm.
that, as well as they can hand us like terrible shit. I had this dream. I'd interviewed this person who claimed that a demon um, had essentially pinned them down in their bed to the point where they were losing their breath, and they uttered out some kind of like religious incantation, and it vanished. And it was like a really intense story. And that night I went to bed and I had this dream where I don't really remember the like meat of the dream, but the part I remember is I ended up in like this foyer of a church, and the demon that she had described pushed me down and then started compressing my chest down. and I could not breathe, and I started to, in the dream, yell out whatever that religious phrase was. And in real life, my wife is sleeping in the bed next to me, and instead of yelling out the religious phrase, I'm yelling out, I sound like Voldemort trying to like
Stop.
Avada Kedavra somebody. And she's like, "Wake up!" And then she wakes me up, and I've got like tears running down my face. And she's like, "What were you dreaming about?" And I told her, and so things like that happen, and I'm like, well, was that some kind of energy transformation from interviewing her? Did this demon leap through the computer into my brain and into my dream, or was it just I was impacted from interviewing the person and I had a nightmare? I don't know, but the thing about dreams is they feel real in the moment, and I can't
Yeah.
forget that happened. So now it's just like a stored memory of mine, which is great.
The other person I wanted to add too was Mark Twain. I think this is the most, out of all the ones I mentioned in this list, Mark Twain's is weird to me. It kind of falls in line with what we've been talking about with our experiences, our family's experiences. So Mark Twain, he apparently had a lot of various premonitions, allegedly, because you said Stephen King. So I feel like Mark Twain is a great touch to this,
Sure, yeah.
because he said that the most notable one was that when he was young, he was working as a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi River. Mark Twain had a vivid dream in which he saw his brother Henry lying in a metal coffin in their sister's living room. In the dream, Henry was dressed in a suit and was laid out for a funeral. Twain was so disturbed by his dream that he immediately sent a letter to his sister warning her about this premonition. Sadly, just a few weeks later, Henry was killed in a tragic explosion on a riverboat, exactly as Twain had dreamt.
Whoa.
This event deeply affected Twain and fueled his belief in the power of premonitions. So I just feel like throughout history, so many people have had premonitions of some kind, whether it's dreaming about tragedy, whether it's helping them conceptualize inventions. I think the one that I really thought was interesting was the one here in Santa Clarita in California, where I don't know the exact person's name, but so bear with me, guys, because I just improving this right now. But basically this guy was sleeping, I think it's like Francisco something, but it's in Santa Clarita. It's like the gold tree. And apparently, allegedly, he had a dream that there was gold underneath the soil the soil by the tree, and he took a nap there, woke up and started digging and found gold. And then apparently that's what like sparked the gold rush, allegedly, of some kind
Hmm.
in this area. So I don't know. I just feel like there's so much gravity to that in some aspects. And I feel like dreams have not been like understood. We still have yet to understand dreams and why we dream things that happen. I know some people, like skeptics, say that like, oh, they're just pattern recognition, but in certain cases like Mark Twain, or even like the golden oak tree in Santa Clarita, your mother, my sister, those are not pattern recognitions. Like, if that's the case, I feel like more, like, especially the people we mentioned, would have had way more dreams of these deaths and tragedies, right? Like, I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think it's also, at least in my experience, when I talk to a skeptic about the paranormal and or premonitions, etc., I'll ask them like, "Hey, do you ever get that feeling where you're driving and somebody's looking at you, and then you look over and you're both looking at each other?" And they're like, "No, that's never happened to me," or any of that kind of like taking on energy. I'll walk into a room sometimes and be like, "Oof," like you just feel like a shift sometimes, and there are people who will never and have never, like, I don't know if it's kind of like some people can just play the guitar, some people can't. I mean, I don't know if it's that
Yeah.
extreme, but there are people that for whatever reason, or they're just devoid of the ability to take that on, and it could just be because the way their brain works, they've shut that off. It may not necessarily be like some people, quote unquote, have the gift, some don't. But I think that's why some skeptics are so staunch in their beliefs, because they have never, like, Santa Claus has never visited them, so they don't believe he's real. Like,
Yeah.
it's just the way it works. I mean, I'm curious to ask you, because you have psychic medium abilities. You can really take energy on. You can read people. So I have had this happen a handful of times in my life that was noteworthy, but I often feel like I meet people, and then not necessarily like I know their story. It's not that, but I just it's just like I have a knowing. Like, it could be as simple as like good, bad. you know.
Mhm.
But somebody that used to be like really close to me, they went through like a separation with their partner, and they didn't want to talk about it. And I just remember talking to them and, about just the fact that they were separating and the trials that that was going to bring in their life. And I just in my head, I just was like, oh man, but I don't even, I don't want to have to make you put more warnings in your episode, but,
Okay.
um, but, but she was sexually assaulted by her partner.
Mhm.
And that's just like the thing that went in my brain. And then down the road, she told me that's what happened. Of course, I wasn't like, hey, let me test my abilities out on you, about this terrible thing that happened in your life. But eventually, she felt comfortable saying what happened and told me. And I was like, man, that is such a weird validation. And stuff like that has happened in my life where something might happen to somebody, and before they can tell me, I just know the thing that happened. And I don't know, like, what is that? Like, what is that? Just like, do you put that under like the download? Like, why I'm very intuitive. I grew up having to be like hypersensitive to my environment, like walk on eggshells to like get through life. And I know that has something to do with it. It's also like, for like a period of time, I played poker a lot instead of like going to class in college. And like, to the point where I had to like start another bank account that my parents didn't know about. And that eventually just became my actual bank account as I grew up as an adult. Um, and that was kind of the same thing. Like, just that hypervigilance helped me in like being able to read people when like going to a casino to play poker or whatever.
Right.
But how do you know if, and I guess this is the age old question, right? Like, how do I know if the reason I'm getting this information into my brain is something extraordinary? Or how do I know if it's just like my intuitiveness and reading like literally the twitches in their eyes or the discomfort in their hands and their mouth, and then my brain goes, oh, it must be because of this. Like, how does somebody know what all answer all the questions, Steffany? I'm just gonna say that.
Well, okay, so there's a couple things to break down with that. So I think, yes, I think in general, you said this early in the beginning of the podcast, where comedians, right, have dealt with a lot of trauma, and so therefore they're able to understand emotions better and make it into humor as an example, right? I think that like I feel personally, a lot of us who are hyper vigilant of body language and demeanors, like, yeah, like we are reading the body language, right? But even that can only say so much about a person, right? In the case of like you driving somewhere to pick up a computer, like how would you have known that? It's just that's not always going to be like that's not, you can't hide behind the facade of like, well, I saw their body language and therefore
Sure.
I equated that. I think that body language may help us guide us to something, but sometimes like having like an idea of like SA or some other things like that, to me, I think that's a little extra layer of things. I think also like the feeling of just knowing things and not knowing where they came from, that's called clear cognizance. It's the gut feeling. It's feeling things and knowing, just knowing without understanding why you know. And a lot of people don't realize this, but in the psychic world, clairsentience, which is like the feeling, just sensing things, right? Like that's the first thing that comes to mind, is just sensing something's off, something, sensing that, something's going to happen or whatever. But then claircognizance is like the second step of that, some more often than not. And then I would say then there's the other clairs to that. So I hope that answers your question. I feel like, yeah, sometimes it is maybe just body language and coming up with a conclusion, but sometimes there are certain situations where you're like, I mean, I wasn't even near that person and I just knew. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I also wanted to backpedal a little bit into like you kind of dispelled a little bit about like premonitions and psychic stuff and like, or sorry, skeptics, and how like they're like, I've never experienced this or I never done this. I also think that people feel like they've never had premonitions because they shut it down. There's like a lot of movies, a lot of movies and pop culture references as to how premonitions work. We have like the infamous, have you ever seen That So Raven?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So like people think that it happens like that, right? Like all of a sudden you just know when you have a clear vision of things, or even like Final Destination.
Ugh.
Yeah.
That movie fucked me up as a kid. Are we allowed to curse on this? I'm sorry. I didn't even
Yeah.
ask. Okay.
Yeah. We can definitely. Yeah, because I feel like Final Destination is I've noticed that Gen Z really loves to reference this movie, and I'm so shocked actually. Are you surprised? Because I'm so
No,
surprised.
me too. And it's always the shot of them being behind like a tractor trailer with the like, pipes hanging out the
Yes.
back.
Yes, and, like, I know that there was that one girl, that lady that had that freak out on the plane where she's like,
Yeah.
"That person
Yeah.
isn't human, blah, blah, blah," and so people were, like, referencing Final Destination, and I kinda feel like this falls into line with this topic because we go back to, like, how sensationalized movies can make premonitions. Like, it's
Mhm.
not Final Destination where all of a sudden you have one premonition, so the rest following per suit is all these deaths.
Right.
I think of like the scene for me, the most memorable scene is the opening because it happened so fast, was the
Mhm.
plane scene where like he falls asleep. Alex is the character's name, but he dreams of the plane crashing, he freaks out. Um Actually, did you know this is random, but Travis Barker, he's always been afraid of flying, but his daughter, Alabama, she was like, I think 3 years old. She said, "Don't go on that plane because like the roof is gonna rip off." And then he got on that, I think did he get on the plane? Yeah, he got on the plane and they got into a crash and he suffered
Oh
all
my
these like
gosh.
third-degree burns. Yeah.
I remember the crash. I didn't realize his daughter gave him like a warning about it.
Yeah, I'll plug in the link in the description if people wanna look into it, but yeah, apparently she said that. So, I don't know, I think part of the whole skeptic thing too is, like, a lot of skeptics will think it's, like, sensationalized, like, in movies, but it even the person saying it out loud more often, unless they're not, like unless they're psychic, I suppose, but they don't even know how they know that premonition. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of skeptics, it falls into the category of, well, if I believe this, where do I stop believing in things? Like how
Mhm.
intense does it get? And I understand that can be kind of scary because then you start to feel like you lose grasp on reality. For me, it's like just looking up in the sky and just thinking about the fact that it goes on forever.
Yeah.
Like that whenever I do that, I have to stop myself because I'm like, oh, starting to feel like sick. Like that's like I still got to pay my bills. Like, I can't just think about like we're floating away. So when my wife and I first started dating, you know how it is in any early relationship. You start to meet their friends, they meet your friends, you take them to like a work party, whatever. So I went to one of her friends she worked with was throwing a party at their house. And so anyway, we went and I was just like meeting, like nice people that were being nice. And then one guy walked up, like very attractive looking guy who was super nice to both of us. And then he just kind of said like, hey, oh, hey, nice to meet you. Good to see you. And turned around and walked off. Literally, as soon as he turned around and got out of earshot, I looked at her and I was like, wow, you fucked him, huh? And she was like, excuse me? And I was like, sorry, that was just, I don't know. Like, I know you did. I mean, it's fine. It's like, and she was like, you don't say that to people. And I was like, well, yeah. And she was like, also, how did you know that I dated him? And I was like, I was like, I don't know how I knew, but literally as soon as he walked up, something just like clicked in my brain and I was like, they have slept together. Like I just knew it. And it's fine. Like, I mean, I was old enough in life that like that like
Yeah.
the older you get, the jealous. I mean, I hope not for everybody, obviously, but I think most mature people, the like jealousy thing just kind of goes out the window. You just don't really care about that stuff anymore, especially like past stuff. And I guess that was kind of her first time probably really experiencing my humor in a situation like that because I was just so proud of myself. I was like, look what I did. And meanwhile, she's just like mortified.
Yeah, like I don't blame. Oh my god. Well, I think this is a great conclusion actually because I feel like premonitions and I know like that I feel like what you picked up was more like psychic energy, but nonetheless like premonitions and energy whether you pick up the future or anything like that, it's such a wide range of experiences and how we just know. Sometimes it's like whether it's dreaming, meditation or just like you said walking to the room we're like I just know.
I just
This
knew.
happened. I just knew.
It was the weirdest thing. Like, and I still think about that sometimes and just chuckle because I can't explain it. It was literally, I think he talked to us for probably 3 minutes. And like I said, he was just nice and cordial. Like,
Yeah, like, there are no limits in how people, uh, perceive this stuff. And I think that, like, one thing I want to mention too, if people do want to understand their dreams, I think it's very much, and premonitions on top of that too. It's like, just have a journal, like literally log it down and kind of try to jot down what you were doing, just anything like that. Like literally look at it as like an experiment. Like when I have these premonitions, what is happening to kind of better discern certain things? Like that's my other recommendation. The other thing too, I also offer, I'm going to put my plug in here. I offer dream interpretations. So if people are curious, you can look at my link tree. I'll plug it in the description. I also have a Discord channel if people want to like continue conversations on the paranormal, supernatural things, or anything like that. I just had somebody join today. I'm like, oh, yay, it's working. We can all join.
awesome.
But just before I wrap this up, where can people find you?
Yeah, so the best place to find me is on the Real Hauntings podcast. You can type it into any place that you listen to podcasts. It should just come up with Real Hauntings podcast, but the full name is Real Hauntings, Real Ghost Stories. You can follow along on social media as well, on Instagram and TikTok at Real Hauntings Podcast. And if you really are just old school, you can check out the website, realhauntingspodcast.com, and everything's there as well. But yeah, we post, or I post an episode every Monday and Friday. Monday's a new episode. Friday, we've been, or the podcast has been around long enough now that I can post like, quote, like rewind episodes on Friday. People seem to dig that. And then we do some fun bonus series, which of course you've been a part of some of those as well. So yeah, check it out. If you're into hearing people tell their firsthand accounts, it's a great place to check out a full library of that stuff. And thank you so much for having me on. I always value just if we get together and just get to talk about this crazy paranormal industry we're in, or if we get to create some content. So I really appreciate you having me on the podcast.
No, thank you for being on here. Also, side note, before we also segue into my final thing, you mentioned that you're going to be at a paranormal convention. Do you have any like discounted promo codes or anything like that? Or will you be plugging into your socials?
Yeah, so I'm going to be at the Para Rock at the Annex in Madison, Wisconsin on August the 3rd. A lot of times Paracons are like 3 days. This one is going to be 1 day, and I'm sure you're like, well, what's that about? So the person that's putting that on, she was a rock promoter or a band promoter for a while, and she is also a medium psychic, and she started to blend those worlds together. So she's putting on, she's the only, I've never heard of this happening before, and it's right up my alley. So I was really excited that she asked me to be part of it. But basically, during the daytime, you're going to have your traditional like booths, people giving speeches, all that good stuff. If you're into Paracon stuff, you certainly know about that. And as the day goes on, it transitions into the ghost hunt aspect of it. So I think traditionally those would be kind of the nightcap of the Paracon. You go out and do your ghost hunts with celebrities or whoever's in attendance. She is going to have Dave Schrader there, and which of course has done a million things, but the Hosier Files is kind of what comes to mind for me. And then she's also going to have the gang there from 28 Days Later? It's on Netflix, the paranormal show. So they're both going to be there, doing the kind of their own things. And but then the thing I'm most excited about, I think it's like 7:00, 7:30. It's going to transition into like a rock show, and so there's going to be bands and drinks and I love going to Paracons and being a part of them, but the thing I always find missing for me personally is like there's never a big party at the end. People are just kind of tired and go to bed. And I come from the world of like going to Dragon Con, Comic Con, that kind of stuff, where you cap everything off with a big party and you get to hang out with all these people. And so I think that's going to be awesome for this Paracon because, you're going to get to hang out with the quote unquote celebrities, whatever. And everybody's just going to be partying and having a great time. She's got some great bands lined up. And this is the second one of these that she's done. So yeah, I've never been to Madison, Wisconsin before. I've never been to Wisconsin, period. I'm going to fly into Minneapolis, spend a night there, then do the con, and then fly out, I think, in Milwaukee. So I can kind of get a feel of the vibe of the area. But
Of the Midwest.
yeah, exactly. So I'm super excited.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. We're going to wrap it up here. So remember, guys, stay strange.
Strange.
Thanks.